Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Risk Radar, a bi-monthly web series that highlights security risks and challenges that SMB organizations need to have on their radar. And I'm your host, Chris Glandon, and my guest this week is Gina Ciavarro. Gina is an accomplished CISO with extensive experience aligning cybersecurity programs with business priorities and implementing solutions across organizations. Her expertise spans deploying security controls, designing risk management programs, governing data, and communicating tech initiatives to executives. Over her career advising global entities, Gina has devised innovative security strategies rooted in integrating solutions with business operations, interoperable systems, and data stewardship. Gina, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, let's kick it off with the straightforward question I have for you. As a leader in security, you have experience enabling security focused collaboration within organizations. So I'm just curious, what strategies do you recommend to employ when working with IT teams and possibly other internal business units to ensure that cybersecurity efforts support core organizational goals? And what have you seen or what has worked in your experience?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I think it's always evolving, and it definitely, the business that you're in matters a lot. So,
Okay.
but what's worked for me, I think, is taking an actual genuine interest in the needs of internal operations teams, the parts of the business that makes money, really understanding like what are the things that move the needle for the organization from a profitability perspective. That is always, those are the little areas where you start to find where you can kind of tack on parts of your security program, or you identify opportunities, or you start to also identify risks way before somebody brings something to you. So
Mm.
taking a true genuine interest in the business, and then also trying to just help and support those operations teams so that you can kind of start to be part of their solutioning process. One of the things that always drives me nuts as a leader is when someone comes to me with the problem and then they've already decided on what the solution is.
Right.
I want to be part of the solutioning process. And I think that's also where you can kind of really start to drive that better alignment across your business.
Yeah, and I mean, we've both seen situations where having a siloed approach doesn't work. It just causes more confusion. It causes frustration within teams. So I really agree with the approach of just understanding what the moving parts are within the organization, and that also helps better with the communication too, because you sort of learn to speak their language along the way.
Yeah, and it's always my expectation that our business leaders take a really strong interest in what I'm doing from a cybersecurity perspective. And I can't expect that from them if I don't reciprocate, right? It's the golden rule.
Mhm.
And I think it just works better if, we can get buy-in through supporting them in their endeavors as well.
Right. Right. Exactly. Um, we always talk about the budget constraints, especially on this program, with a focus on SMB, right? There's always that limited budget, and I mean that extends beyond SMBs. But just curious, how do you demonstrate the value and the need for certain security investments that you want to place into your program to board members or executive leadership teams, in terms or language that they care about?
Yeah, I think that's another one where you really kind of have to expand outside of your typical scope as a security leader. So I know that my board and my executive leadership are always going to be reading Wall Street Journal. They're going to be, they're going to be watching the financial news. They're going to be following up on things they read in Bloomberg, whatever it might be, right? Um, so I go to those news sources as well, and I see like, okay, what's like the latest scary cybersecurity thing that's been either written about or is in the news, because I know I'm going to get those questions. And then it's always followed by, well, this horrible thing happened to someone else. How do we make sure that that doesn't happen to us? Right. And that's where you also then have to really be ready to have a hard conversation about like, it could happen to us, right? We don't
Hmm.
for that today. So really talking through like, here's the actual risk. Or it could be like, yeah, we're totally covered for that. We've been covered on that for years. Like that's a much more fun conversation to have. Um, but I've had executives come to me and say, "Hey, what's quantum computing? Like, what's your concern?" I'm like, "We don't have control for that, right?" So like, there are things that we just don't have, and that's okay. And it's not a personal failure or failure of anybody. It's just you got to start be ready to have those conversations. And I think when you start talking about budgets, I also try and just kind of wrap a big expend in a, hey, we could also potentially spend a little less, or we could step our way into that next level of maturity by changing our business process. And unfortunately, that can kind of make the leadership team say, "Oh, can we just buy a tool for that? We're not ready to change our business process," because it feels
Hmm.
better to change your business process. But those are really like, I think, understanding what it is that they're looking for, and then also talking about like all of the stuff that we can do that takes nothing, right? Like we can patch, we can make sure that we're monitored. Like there's um there's a lot of cyber hygiene stuff that just doesn't cost a lot.
Yeah.
Like let's sell the program as a whole, right? There's things that we're going to spend a lot of money on. There's things that we can do for free, and at least then shows that you're not. I don't know. I think sometimes leadership teams think that the CISO has like an ego thing about like how big can my team be, how big can my budget be. I don't
Right.
like if I could not spend a lot of money, that would be great. But like you know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I really like the approach that you take with sort of
money.
forecasting their their um their mindset, right?
Mhm.
Understanding what they're reading into. They're reading the headlines and they're moving on. And so yeah, I just bookmarked Wall Street Journal because I want to steal that from you now.
Yeah, that's a
Um
good one. Fast Company. I got the whole list.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But no, I mean, but then you at least have time to sort of craft that messaging to the right
Mhm.
people in terms of, the terminology that they know, what they expect to bring to the table. And
Yeah.
that's great advice. So um when you're looking at maybe smaller companies, right? There's oftentimes that they confuse what current technology is out there and what it does, and looking at the latest bleeding edge security technology, really understanding what's behind it. So what criteria should SMBs use to evaluate new security solutions to ensure that they're filling a real business need before investing in them versus just buying what they read about maybe on the Wall Street Journal, right? So how do they how do they avoid falling into the trap of just buying that new shiny object?
So I think the number one thing that I do, especially like coming into a new organization, is creating a technology capabilities map. And I think Chris, when I first met you when I was doing DLP, I think we did the same thing for you guys. But we big spreadsheet. What can our tools? What do they functionally do? Because I think the problem we have today is that from a marketing perspective, people are calling the same technologies by many different names. They're calling many different technologies by the same name. Like, I don't know how many times I've had a meeting in the last probably 18 months about MDR, XDR, managed security services. It's like,
Yeah.
what what are we doing here, right? Like that can be so many different things. I've had different sales teams tell me that it's different things, right? Or they'll ask you like, "Oh, do you know what XDR is?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I know what I think it is." You tell me what you're trying to sell.
Yeah.
But that capabilities matrix is like, functionally, what does this thing do? Does it stop bad email? Does it prevent, you know, good traffic, or, good data from leaving and bad traffic from coming in? And then when someone comes to you, maybe they did read in the Wall Street Journal that like some company got breached because they didn't have a firewall, let's say. Not that that's really happening anymore, but as an example, right? You can say, "Hey, well, we do have a firewall," or, we're not using firewall because we don't need one, because we're achieving the same functional outcome with a different tool. And that's where I think you can start to kind of cut through some of the confusion around like, you need a SIM, right? Why do I need a SIM? Do I need a SIM because I need to correlate events? Do I need a SIM because I'm looking for insider threat? Or do I need a SIM because somebody's concerned that I'm not keeping all my logs in the same place?
Mm-hmm.
And then what's the business value? And like, what are we getting out of that from a risk reduction standpoint? And I think that's when you really start to have those real conversations about like, is this the right thing for us? And what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And that capabilities matrix can also help you if you look at like potential capabilities, since so many products are going more towards like a platform view.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, do I need a full-blown other DLP system, or can I just add a couple of DLP modules onto existing platforms that I already have?
Right.
And maybe save some money in that respect at the same time. So that capabilities matrix is going to be like a key artifact when you're doing any kind of like tech build out or improvement or upgrade, modernization for your program.
Yeah, and that's great advice, and I think that capabilities matrix can also lie under just a basic inventory of what you own already. Because when you get into these conversations, depending on the maturity of your cybersecurity program, you really need to know what tools you have,
Mhm.
or even down to the Microsoft O365 licensing, because you could have security capabilities there that you don't know about. So just having an inventory of what you have, what version you're on,
Yeah,
and then building out that capabilities matrix.
exactly. Yep. Um, I feel like I become an Office 365 like licensing expert every 6 months, and then my knowledge completely goes to shit when they change it again.
I know.
But that's a huge, like, there's so much value in there, especially if you don't have a lot of extra budget to spend. There's so much, like, stuff that's included. It's not really free, but
Mhm.
that you can really just start leveraging. And the other thing, too, with SaaS applications and cloud platforms, who knows if your users might already, that shadow IT, right? Maybe you have multiple password vaults in the organization because somebody just went out with a credit card and bought some tool that they felt like they needed, and really starting to kind of corral that. And it also gives you an option for your users to say like, hey, I know you've got this other password vault, but we have those same capabilities with the corporate provided one, and so you're
Yeah.
going to need to move to our platform. And that's you having that in your back pocket at all times is a huge help.
Yeah, and you could hit that wall too when you're looking at cybersecurity insurance, right? When they're telling
Mhm.
you these are the controls that you need to have in place, and you see SIM, and it's like, okay, first of all, I need to know why I need this SIM, but now it's a requirement to get cyber insurance.
Yeah.
So I guess that could be sort of confusing for someone in that position to understand, okay, I need this, but why do I need this? And I need someone to
Mhm.
help show value and
Yeah,
why that is.
and communicating to the underwriters or your broker, like, okay, we don't maybe have something that is called a SIM, right? But we have all of these capabilities already. I've had many conversations about privileged access management. Like, well, you don't have a system, right? I'm like, well, I don't, right? But I have it in these other ways. Here's how we're managing privileged access management. To me is a verb. It's not a thing,
Yeah,
right? And so like if we are doing the action of managing our privileged access, right?
right.
Would I love to have a PAM tool? Of course. I would love to go and spend $200,000 on like the fanciest PAM tool I can have. And sometimes using the leverage of cyber insurance is a great way to get that budget for that PAM tool. But if I really need something else, then I can get by talking through like what is the process or what are the other combinations of technologies that are getting us to that main goal. Your cyber insurer wants you to have a PAM tool because they don't want
Mm.
your privileged accounts to be hacked.
Right.
And then using that as an entry point to completely just own the entire environment, right? Like that's what
Yeah.
they're worried about. They don't
And
really
that's why it's
care about
important to
your PAM
understand that.
tool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's important to understand the verbiage that they're using,
Mhm.
and able to fully understand that, and saying, "Oh, I got to invest in X, Y, and Z now." You
Yeah.
know. Um, What are your thoughts on leveraging MSPs or SMBs leveraging MSPs? And what key factors should be considered when vetting an MSP or when looking for an MSP? Is it cost, expertise, responsiveness, reporting capabilities, all of the above? I guess how would you prioritize what an SMB should look for?
Yeah, I think managed services are great. I think it helps solve a problem, a staffing problem. It's so hard to hire and manage your own SOC and I mean, just like the infrastructure to build that out. I think for most SMBs, it's just not really practical. Um, and again, if you think about like business value, I don't know that you're reducing enough risk by managing it yourself than you would get out of using managed service provider. I think one of the biggest things, and I've made this mistake in the past, where like I've expected my managed service provider to act and behave the exact way that I want them to. And that was not necessarily in their original statement of work, or maybe I've inherited them and I'm like trying to fit them into my mold of how I want them to operate. And I've had them say like, no, we don't do that. We don't do it like that. Like we're happy to build something else for you, but like that's not how we operate. So I think when you're evaluating managed service provider, it's like, okay, who do I have on my team today? What activities can we outsource? Like, what are those activities that you don't need company specific background? You don't necessarily need to know the players all that much. You don't need to know what makes the business tick as much. Those are all of those things that you can outsource. And maybe it's not events. Maybe you outsource, maybe you manage vulnerability management, or maybe, like there's
Mhm.
a lot of different ways you can do it now. And so I think it's really aligning your MSP to how you want to run your program, how you want to run your team. I don't need somebody to do vulnerability management for me because I've got a superstar on my team that's working with our business customers, that's getting things, updated and they're doing a great job. So like, I don't need that as part of my managed service. So I think it's resource mix, it's capability mix. I think number one, number two. I think number three, which is probably not in any RFP, but it's how good are we at having conflict? Who is the
Mhm.
MSP or managed service provider that like I feel like I can really argue with or have a disagreement or
Right.
identify gaps and like we can fix stuff together. They can tell me when I'm being a bad customer, right? When they're
Yeah.
like, hey, you can't expect us to respond to these events in 20 seconds just because you were looking at the system at the time, right? Like
Right.
there's that to me is really important because it's my intention always to be all up in their business and really managing them actively. And so it has to be a team that I like genuinely like. And I know they mean well, and I feel like I can have a disagreement and work through problems with them. And that we're kind of in it together and that we want the same outcomes. That's super important to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's the game changer as far as like happy customers versus unhappy customers.
Yeah. Yeah. You need to be able to push back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in addition to MSPs, just third-party providers in general, they're a reliable source for many businesses out there, many business functions. Um, what due diligence can SMBs perform when evaluating general third-party providers to validate, their security postures?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So the first one is like just a basic gut check of is your security as good or better than mine? If you're just purely looking at like, are you introducing any additional risk into my environment? Um, and you should be able to rattle those off yourself. Like I know off the top of my head, I can ask, 5, 6 questions, and I can know if they're doing a better job of it than I am.
Mhm.
And I hope that they are. That's my expectation. So I think that's a big one. I think the other, for any third party kind of assessment or analysis, I think it's also important to understand, look at their, to the best of your knowledge, like what are their financials? Who are they backed by? Is this company going to exist? Do I think they're going to get acquired? Is that a problem for me?
Mhm.
I think we've seen in the last couple of years, there's been a little bit of some roll up activity. And it's like, oh, well, my favorite vendor just got bought by some big behemoth. And like,
Right.
now what do I do? Right. And that changes things. Or like, well, now I'm on this other platform. So you can't really see the future, but I think it's also like, okay, is the thing I'm about to buy, is this a feature or is this a standalone product? If it's a feature that you're buying, that you're trying to plug into something else, it's highly likely that the thing that you're plugging that into is going to buy that feature.
Yeah.
So that's something to think about if it matters to your program. It always matters to me. I'm always just kind of curious what's going on in that space. Um, and then looking like where are their operations, right? The world is crazy. Are there geopolitical risks that you need to think about, right? If they're based in somewhere, that's having geopolitical issues, like there's macroeconomic factors. I think like there's a lot that you have to kind of consider um, above and beyond, and like, of course, does it fit the need that you're trying to solve? Do they have
Right.
insurance? Are they taking your data in? Like, I'm kind of putting those aside because I think that's, I'd be shouting into the void to be like, hey, check and make sure like they're encrypting your data, right? Everyone knows that. But I
Mhm.
think it's these other things to really think through, again, from that business strategy perspective of like, how's this going to fit in the larger ecosystem?
Yeah, how about like the compliance aspect too? I guess depending on how that partnership would work, you wanna make sure that they have certain compliance
Yeah,
uh, certificates or somebody that's gonna be able to legally do business with you.
of course. And then I also think too, like I've had two CISO jobs where I've been in the services industry, right? Professional services. So we sign contracts with our clients all the time that says, like we will have these requirements and we will also enforce your clients' contractual obligations on our vendors. And so really knowing what promises you've made from a contractual obligation perspective is super important. And that, again, becomes that baseline for assessment for any of your vendors. Because you don't want to accidentally slip out of contractual compliance with your clients or your end customer because, you forgot that you signed that contract that said
Right.
you would. And, it's also from just like a data residency perspective, if your company has global expectations or future growth, like you want to really kind of start thinking about that before it becomes an issue. Trying to really quickly get GDPR compliant or something like that just never really works that great. So if you can make sure that your vendors can support a multi-geo type environment, or they can do certain things that will help you reach any of those potential future compliance standards. Those are always like great things to look at and make sure that you account for when you're doing vendor selection.
Yeah, great point. Um, so we're down to the last 5 minutes, and this conversation would not be complete if I didn't talk AI. So emerging AI technologies, and let's talk about chatbots. Right, they've taken the
Yeah.
world by storm, both large enterprises, SMBs. Um, what governance best practices do you suggest or do you recommend SMBs consider with these type of technologies, specifically chatbots, to ensure proper data handling, access control, governance or oversight? Um, and what have you seen work thus far?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think avoidance is not going to work when it comes to AI.
Yeah.
I think there's so much value in it from a business perspective that we have to like get engaged. And so getting engaged early on and really talking to your users and getting out in front of knowing that they've heard about this thing, they're probably looking it up, they might be using it for different things in their personal lives. So it's a data governance, it's a data conversation of like, hey, this is basically any website that has a comment box or any kind of box that you can enter some data into. So like from a corporate perspective, do not put any of our company data, our customers' data, clients' data, your personal data. Don't put it in there because you don't control where it's going. you don't know enough about how it's going to be used either today or in the future. And I think that's another thing to really think about is like as this expands and as we continue to mature from an AI perspective, like we don't know how our inputs today are going to get used in the future. It's almost, I mean, it's like when we, first started using Facebook. When I first started using Facebook, when I first came out, I think I was in college, and we put everything on there. We had no idea what it was going to be used for in the future, right? And then that stuff potentially comes back to bite you. Fortunately, I was not whipping it up too much in college, so I don't have anything to worry about. But I think like that's where I think we're at from an AI perspective. Like we just truly don't know. And then I think so being really direct with your users and even within the business, right? Because those operational business people are going to start coming here like, hey, we want to use AI. We want to use AI, right? To try to have those conversations about like, okay, well, don't want to use the public version because we may as well just be putting it on Facebook. How do we look at using enterprise versions of these tools? And then what are we trying to get out of it, right? Because chatbots have existed for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. And there are ways that you can do a call and response type of activity with a chatbot without leveraging, ChatGPT, right? So I think that's the other, going back to, talking through what's the problem that we're trying to solve. And then, so I think policy control, obviously administrative control, like, hey, don't put anything stupid in there. And then technical controls as far as just like, any of your CASB, DLP, any of your like data transfer protection mechanisms that you have to implement those, just even at a really high level of just kind of trying to keep some keywords in your PII out of that ChatGPT box, I think is a really good idea. And I think on the flip side of it too is like thinking about ways that maybe you can use it for your own team. How do you build some kind of something that your team can leverage to make their lives easier? Like, do we use ChatGPT or Copilot or something to help us draft emails to our end users? Like when my end users click on a link they should have clicked on, right? Like maybe I just use it I don't have to write my own email every single time, right? Like there's a lot that I think we can use as practitioners to make our lives easier without exposing our corporate data, without exposing anything really sensitive. And then, also partnering very heavily with your legal team to make sure that, they think through with you all of your legal and compliance obligations on top of the pure security play.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I am starting to see more organizations implement policy, implement training on using chatbots. So I think things are moving in that direction.
And it's not even a new policy in a lot of places, right? Like you just update your data policy, your data classification policy, or your data handling acceptable use policy. It's literally a blurb of like, and including, these types of tools. Like, and I think we're maybe making a mountain out of a molehill in some respects, as far as like, what's our generative AI policy going to be? It's like, is it not just data in a website somewhere? Can't we just, make everyone's life easier and generate that policy to your users and say, oh, hey, and by the way, it includes this thing that you guys have been using.
That's key too, is getting that messaging over, not just having a policy, but you have to get that messaging and understanding over to the end users as well.
Yeah.
So, Gina, thanks so much for joining. This was great catching up with you. Where can our listeners find and connect with you online?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm an extremely boring follow. I post almost nothing. But I'm always available to help other people if anyone needs anything. And I am going to be growing my team throughout the year, so keep an eye out. I post jobs. Maybe I don't post like jokes or anything like that, or musings. But definitely look for some roles to be posted later this year. And just feel free to reach out if you need anything.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. Don't forget BarCode Security. We're a firm dedicated to helping small to medium-sized businesses in their security journey. You can check us out at barcodesecurity.com to learn more about our services, as well as listen to the podcast as well. So take care, everyone. I'll see you next time.